The sun descends slowly toward the western sea, casting long, soft shadows across the well-worn stone quays of the port city of Ugarit. A broad-beamed merchant ship, its single mast now bare of sail, is nudged gently against the dock by the evening tide, its tired timbers smelling faintly of the Cypriot pine from which it was so carefully constructed. Along a sturdy gangplank, laborers move with a practiced and unhurried rhythm, their backs bent under the considerable weight of heavy, ox-hide-shaped ingots of pure copper. The metal itself seems to capture the day's dying light, glowing with a final, fiery blush that promises wealth and industry for the morning to come. The air, growing cooler now but still thick and warm, carries a complex perfume of cedarwood logs stacked for export, the dusty sweetness of grain from the hinterlands, and the sharp, exotic scent of spices sealed within large clay amphorae from lands far to the east. A traveler might discern the low murmur of a dozen different tongues, their commerce overseen by a quiet scribe who makes his neat, wedge-shaped marks upon a tablet of damp clay, recording the wealth of kingdoms. Here, at this great nexus of the known world, it feels as though the ships will arrive and depart forever, an eternal and predictable pulse against the solid stone of civilization. Good evening, and welcome back to Empires at Dusk. Tonight, we drift not into the story of a single empire, but into the shared twilight of an entire world of interconnected kingdoms. Our journey takes us to the warm shores of the late Bronze Age Mediterranean, where the great palaces of the Hittites and the fortress cities of Mycenae and Greece stood bathed in a golden light. Their gilded world, linked by diplomatic letters etched on clay and by ships laden with copper and tin, seemed as eternal as the sea itself, yet it proved to be a profoundly fragile system, whose sudden unraveling serves as a quiet reminder of how even the most brilliant civilizations can fade into a long and silent twilight. Before the long silence fell, before the cities of bronze and gold became mounds of earth and whispers in later memory, there was a world bound together by the slow and steady pulse of the sea. One might have stood on the coast of Cyprus in the late 14th century before our era and watched the sun descend over the wine-dark water, catching the triangular sail of a trading vessel making for the coast of the Levant, its hull laden with copper from the island's deep mines. That vessel was not an anomaly, not a brave and lonely venture, but a single thread in a vast and glittering tapestry that stretched from the highlands of Anatolia to the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, from the rocky shores of the Aegean to the eternal, sun-drenched river valley of the Nile. This was the late Bronze Age, a period of such profound interconnectedness and stability that for the kings who ruled its great domains, it must have felt as though it were forged by the gods to last forever. This was a world governed by what modern historians have come to call the Great Powers Club, an exclusive circle of mighty empires and kingdoms that dominated the eastern Mediterranean. In Egypt, the pharaohs of the new kingdom ruled with a divine confidence born of a millennium of civilization, their monumental temples and tombs at Thebes reflecting a seemingly limitless command of labor and gold. To the north, across the sea and upon the rugged Anatolian plateau, the Hittite Empire had its seat of power in the sprawling, heavily fortified capital of Hattusa, its warrior kings controlling the crucial land routes and silver mines of the mountains. Further east, in the cradle of civilization between the Tigris and Euphrates, The Kassite kings of Babylonia presided over an ancient and learned culture, their authority respected and their astronomical knowledge coveted. And to the west, scattered across the Greek mainland and the islands of the Aegean, were the citadels of the Mycenaeans, warlike and wealthy palace states whose rulers, the Wanakes, looked out from their immense cyclopean walls over fields of grain and olive groves. These powers were not isolated entities, perpetually at war, but were instead engaged in a continuous and intricate diplomatic dance, a reality brought to life for us by a remarkable collection of clay tablets discovered in the sands of Egypt. The Amarna letters, as they are now known, represent the preserved diplomatic correspondence of the Egyptian court from the mid-14th century, and they open a small but brilliantly lit window into the minds of these ancient rulers. Written not in Egyptian hieroglyphs or any local tongue, but in the common language of international diplomacy, Akkadian cuneiform, these letters reveal a family of kings, a fraternity of power. They addressed one another not as rivals, but as equals, with the customary greeting, "To my brother, the king of the land, thus speaks your brother, the king of the land. For me, all goes well. For you, may all go well." Through these communiques, a constant stream of requests, reassurances, and lavish gifts flowed between the royal courts, each item meticulously recorded by palace scribes. The king of Babylon might send a finely wrought chariot, its wooden frame gleaming with electrum, pulled by a team of prized horses, while the king of Mitanni in northern Syria might offer lapis lazuli, a stone of celestial blue mined in the distant mountains of what is now Afghanistan. In return, they all sought the one commodity that Egypt possessed in legendary abundance: gold. One letter from the king of Assyria complains good-naturedly that gold in Egypt seems to be as common as dust, so surely his brother the pharaoh could send a little more. These exchanges were cemented by the most valuable gifts of all, royal daughters, who would be sent with enormous dowries and retinues to become wives in foreign courts, their presence a living symbol of the alliance between two great houses. A traveler moving between these capitals would have felt the weight of this shared system, a protocol of power understood from the Nile Delta to the shores of the Aegean Sea. This diplomatic web was sustained by an even more complex network of commercial trade, a circulatory system that carried the lifeblood of the Bronze Age world. The very name of the era speaks to its fundamental need. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, was the essential material for tools, armor, and weapons. And its constituent metals were rarely found in the same place. Great, heavy ingots of copper, often cast in the shape of an oxide for easier carrying, were mined on an industrial scale in Cyprus and shipped out from bustling ports across the entire Mediterranean. The tin, however, had to travel much further, its exact origin still debated by archaeologists, but likely brought overland by long donkey caravans from remote sources deep in Central Asia, a journey of many months. The meeting of these two materials in the foundries of a Mycenaean palace or a Syrian coastal city was a small miracle of long-distance logistics, a process repeated thousands of times over to equip the armies and artisans of the great kings. A merchant ship setting out from the sophisticated port of Ugarit, on the Syrian coast, would have been a microcosm of this international world. Its sturdy hull, planked with Lebanese cedar, might carry a primary cargo of those Cypriot copper ingots, stacked deep in the hold. Alongside them, a scribe would have recorded large Canaanite amphorae, their clay bodies sealed with resin, containing the fine wine of the Levantine hills or precious perfumed oil destined for an Egyptian temple. There might be chests filled with elegant Mycenaean pottery, painted with stylized octopuses or marching soldiers, a fashionable luxury item desired in palaces from Knossos to Hattusa. Perhaps there were raw elephant tusks from Syria, or blocks of ebony that had traveled up the Nile from Nubia, and even Baltic amber, passed down a chain of traders from the cold forests of the north. The air on such a vessel would have been thick with the smells of pine resin, salt spray, and the faint, earthy scent of the terracotta jars, the sounds a mixture of creaking timber and the murmur of a multilingual crew. This constant movement of goods, people, and ideas fostered a remarkably cosmopolitan culture among the elites of the late Bronze Age. While peasants in the hinterlands may have lived and died within a few miles of their birth, a courtier in any of the great palaces would have been familiar with foreign styles of dress, art, and literature. The shared script of Akkadian cuneiform was the bedrock of this shared world, taught in scribal schools from Mesopotamia to Egypt and even, it seems, in the Levant. A messenger arriving with a clay tablet could be confident that a local scribe could read its contents aloud to the king, translating the delicate nuances of a diplomatic proposal or a trade agreement. This common literacy created a shared intellectual space, allowing for the circulation of myths, legal codes, and scientific knowledge, binding the ruling classes together in a common literate culture, even as their own people spoke a dozen different tongues. This shared culture was also expressed in the very architecture of power. Whether one arrived at the gates of Mycenae in Greece, with its awe-inspiring walls built of colossal, unworked stones, or approached the great temple complexes of Karnak in Egypt, or stood before the citadel of Hattusa in Anatolia, the message was the same, the proclamation of overwhelming strength, permanence, and divine favor. The palaces themselves were more than just royal residences, they were the nerve centers of a highly centralized system known as the palace economy. From these administrative hubs, the king and his bureaucrats controlled the production and redistribution of nearly all goods. Scribes with clay tablets and styluses meticulously tracked harvests from royal lands, the output of state-run weaving workshops, the stores of bronze in the armories, and the rations of grain allotted to soldiers and workers. This rigid, top-down system was immensely efficient in times of stability, capable of marshalling the resources for monumental construction and large-scale warfare, reinforcing the sense that the world was an orderly, predictable place, managed by the steady hand of a divinely appointed king. For a person living within this structure, looking up at the towering walls of their city and the well-stocked granaries of the palace, the idea that it could all simply cease to be would have been not just frightening, but truly unthinkable. The world that would one day be lost did not begin in chaos, but in an age of almost unimaginable order, a time when the great kings referred to one another as brother in their eloquent letters, etched in the Akkadian tongue upon tablets of baked clay. This was a world of empires, a constellation of glittering palaces and cities that stretched from the fertile banks of the Nile to the rocky highlands of Anatolia and across the wine-dark sea to the shores of Greece. It was a system built upon bronze and gold, upon the tireless work of 1,000,000 farmers, and upon the absolute authority of divine kings whose power seemed as eternal as the rising sun. To understand the twilight that followed, one must first wander through the brilliant afternoon of this age, when the great powers stood at their zenith, their capitals like jewels set upon the earth, each a universe unto itself. One might begin a journey in the north of Egypt, in the sprawling delta city of Pi-Ramesses, the great capital built by Ramesses II. Here, where the Nile's life-giving waters splintered into 1,000 channels before meeting the Great Green Sea, a metropolis pulsed with a steady, confident rhythm. A visitor arriving by barge would have seen countless temples with towering pylons of white limestone, their surfaces covered in painted reliefs that caught the morning light, telling stories of Pharaoh's might and divine favor. The air would have been thick with the scent of lotus blossoms from ornamental pools, mixed with the dust of construction and the pervasive, sweet smell of baking bread from the state granaries that fed 250,000 souls. The city was a testament to centralized power, its districts laid out in a grid for soldiers, for priests, for foreign artisans, and for the vast bureaucracy that administered the wealth of 2 lands, all under the serene and watchful gaze of the pharaoh, a living god on earth. From the orderly splendor of the Nile, a trader's ship might sail northward, hugging the coast of the Levant, eventually turning inland towards the heart of another great empire, that of the Hittites. Here, the landscape changed dramatically from the flat, fertile plains of Egypt to the high, arid plateau of Anatolia, a windswept land of harsh winters and sun-baked summers. Perched atop a rugged, defensible rock outcrop, surrounded by forests and crags, lay the capital, Hattusa. This was not a city of open avenues and ornamental gardens, it was a fortress, its might embodied in the 5 miles of double stone walls that followed the contours of the hills. A traveler passing through one of its monumental gates, perhaps the Lion Gate with its powerfully carved guardians, would have felt a sense of awe and intimidation. Inside, the city was a labyrinth of stone-paved streets climbing and descending the slopes, leading to temples dedicated to the 1,000 gods of the Hittite pantheon, a collection of deities gathered from every corner of their conquered lands. The air here carried the smell of wood smoke and roasting meat from the garrisons, and the clang of hammer on bronze from the royal armories echoed against the granite hillsides, a constant reminder that Hittite power was forged in iron will and military discipline. Far to the west, across the turbulent Aegean Sea, lay a different kind of kingdom, a world of warrior princes and citadel palaces. A ship navigating the treacherous coastline of the Peloponnese might anchor in the bay below the mighty fortress of Mycenae, the legendary home of Agamemnon. To reach the palace, one would ascend a steep, winding ramp, passing through the monumental Lion Gate, its lentil stone weighing more than 100 tons, a feat of engineering that later generations would attribute to the mythical Cyclopes. The walls themselves, built of massive, irregular stone blocks, were a statement of raw, unassailable power. Within these Cyclopean fortifications, the palace, or Megaron, was a more intimate affair than the sprawling complexes of Egypt or Hatti, centered around a great hall with a large circular hearth. It was here the Wanax, the Mycenaean king, would hold court, the smoke from the fire staining the brightly colored frescoes on the walls, depicting scenes of hunting, processions, and warfare. The air was briny with sea salt, and the prevailing sound was not the murmur of bureaucrats but the wind whistling through the battlements and the distant bleating of sheep on the hillsides below, their wool destined for the palace looms, their value carefully noted by scribes on small, palm-leaf-shaped clay tablets. These three great centers of power, Pyrameses, Hattusa, and Mycenae, were the anchors of the late Bronze Age world, each a node in a vast network of trade, diplomacy, and rivalry. Yet for all their differences in culture and geography, they shared a common foundation for their dominance, the chariot. This was the age of the chariot kingdoms, a time when a military aristocracy, bound by oaths of loyalty to their king, ruled from the back of a light, two-wheeled vehicle that was the era's superweapon. The chariot itself was a masterpiece of composite construction, its frame made of bent wood, its wheels spoked for lightness and speed, its platform just large enough for a driver and an archer. It was not a clumsy, heavy cart for smashing through infantry lines, but a mobile firing platform, a swift and elegant instrument of shock and awe, drawn by two highly trained, selectively bred horses. The true power of the chariot lay not only in its speed but in its pairing with another technological marvel, the composite bow. Constructed from laminated layers of wood, horn, and animal sinew, this bow possessed a power and range far exceeding that of a simple wooden stave, capable of punching through the bronze-scale armor worn by even elite infantry. A corps of chariots, sweeping across the flat plains of Syria or the Nile Delta, could unleash a devastating hail of arrows upon a marching army, disorienting and breaking their formations long before the infantry even met. To own and maintain a chariot, with its matched pair of horses and its specialized weaponry, was fantastically expensive, ensuring that warfare remained the exclusive domain of a trained, high-status warrior class. This elite, the Marianu as they were known in the Near East, formed the backbone of the great king's armies, their loyalty ensuring control over the vast agricultural populations that generated the surplus wealth upon which the entire palace system depended. Their lives were dedicated to the arts of war, their deeds celebrated in epic poetry, and their rewards were grants of land and a privileged position at the king's court, their very existence a guarantee of the rigid social hierarchy. The ultimate expression of this system of chariot-based state power came in the 13th year of the reign of Rameses II, around the year 1274 BCE, on the plains south of the city of Kadesh in what is now Syria. Here, the two great superpowers of the age, the Egyptian Empire under Rameses and the Hittite Empire under Muwatalli II, brought the full weight of their military establishments to bear. The Battle of Kadesh was not so much a single, decisive engagement as it was a monumental collision of two logistical systems, the culmination of years of preparation. One can imagine the sheer scale of the undertaking, perhaps 50,000 men and more than 5,000 chariots converging on a single point, a concentration of force previously unseen in human history. The dust raised by their marching columns and the thunder of thousands of chariot wheels would have been visible for miles, a testament to the ability of the palace bureaucracies to marshal resources on an epic scale, to move mountains of grain, water, and bronze weaponry across hundreds of miles of territory. The battle itself, as recorded in the triumphant but perhaps not entirely reliable accounts of Rameses, was a near-run thing, a swirling melee of chariots and infantry that for a time threatened the life of the pharaoh himself. Yet the true significance of Kadesh lies not in its chaotic violence, but in what came after. The confrontation resulted in a strategic stalemate, a recognition by both empires that neither could truly destroy the other. This dawning realization led, some 16 years later, to one of the most remarkable documents of the ancient world, the world's first known comprehensive peace treaty. An Egyptian version was carved onto the temple walls at Karnak, while a Hittite copy, inscribed on a tablet of pure silver, was sent to the court of Rameses. This was not a mere cessation of hostilities, but a detailed pact of non-aggression, mutual defense, and the orderly extradition of political refugees. The kings, once bitter rivals, now addressed each other as brothers and equals, sealing their new alliance with the exchange of royal daughters in marriage. The Treaty of Kadesh inaugurated a period of unprecedented stability and prosperity that would last for over half a century, a golden autumn for the late Bronze Age world, where the great powers coexisted in a delicate, carefully managed balance. This long peace, guaranteed by the threat of chariot armies and the bonds of diplomacy, allowed the defining institution of the age to reach its fullest expression, the palace economy. In Mycenae, Hattusa, and the great cities of Egypt and the Levant, the palace was not merely the residence of the king, it was the all-encompassing heart of the state's economic life. It was a highly centralized, redistributive system, where the surplus production of the entire kingdom, grain, wine, olive oil, wool, metals, and luxury goods, flowed into the palace storerooms and was then doled out again to support the army, the priesthood, the artisans, and the vast bureaucracy that managed the entire enterprise. Nothing was left to chance, and nothing went unrecorded. The engine of this system was the scribe, a highly trained and respected professional who sat at the nexus of all economic activity. One might picture a scribal office in the palace at Pylos or Ugarit, a quiet, cool room, away from the heat of the sun, the air smelling of damp clay and parched papyrus. Here, men and perhaps women spent their days with stylus in hand, meticulously recording the lifeblood of the kingdom onto fragile tablets. A typical tablet might list a consignment of purple-dyed wool delivered to the palace from a provincial village, another might detail the rations of barley and beer allotted to a crew of bronzesmiths, while a third could be a tally of bronze spearheads stored in a palace armory. These records, written in complex scripts like the Hittite cuneiform or the Mycenaean Linear B, were the software of the Bronze Age state. They allowed the central administration to conduct censuses, levy taxes, equip armies, and manage international trade with a precision that seems almost modern. The palace knew, down to the last bushel, how much grain was in its silos, and down to the last man, how many rowers it could call upon to crew its fleet. This intricate web of records created a system of immense power and efficiency, capable of funding monumental construction projects and fielding vast armies. Yet, it was also a system of profound fragility, utterly dependent on the stability of the palace that stood at its center, and on the survival of the small, literate elite who kept its secrets on tablets of unbaked clay, which could be washed away as easily as writing in the sand. To understand this late, great age of bronze, one must first appreciate the profound depth of its interconnectedness, a vast and intricate web of exchange that bound together the shores of the eastern Mediterranean in a shared, glittering destiny. One might begin a journey of understanding in the bustling port of Ugarit, on the Syrian coast, a city whose very existence was a testament to the currents of trade and diplomacy. Arriving by sea as the afternoon sun cast long shadows from the masts of the assembled ships, a traveler would have caught the scent of cedarwood from the nearby mountains mingling with the sharper tang of salt, dried fish, and the sweet perfume of expensive oils being decanted on the docks. The harbor teemed with vessels of every description, broad-beamed Mycenaean galleys with their single, dark red sails, long and elegant Egyptian barges designed for the Nile but sturdy enough for coastal voyages, and the ubiquitous Canaanite round ships, the workhorses of the sea, their hulls filled with precious cargo. Stepping from the sun-bleached planks of the quay into the city's narrow, winding streets, the light would soften, filtering down between the upper stories of tall, stone and timber houses. The air here was thick with the sounds of a dozen languages, a constant, murmuring polyglot of voices where a merchant from the island of Cyprus might haggle over the price of copper ingots with a buyer from Hattusa, the Hittite capital, using the shared diplomatic tongue of Akkadian cuneiform. A pair of Egyptian officials, identifiable by their clean-shaven heads and white linen kilts, might pass by, their expressions impassive as they made their way to the royal palace to deliver a message from the pharaoh. The local Ugaritic dialect, a Semitic tongue, was the common speech of the streets, but one could easily discern the guttural consonants of Hurrian, the clipped vowels of a Proto-Greek spoken by sailors from the Aegean, and the formal court language of the Egyptians, all weaving together into a single, complex urban symphony. It was a city where one could purchase lapis lazuli that had traveled for months from the mountains of Afghanistan, fine linen from the Nile Delta, and amber that had journeyed from the cold shores of the Baltic Sea, each object a silent witness to a world more connected than it would be again for over 1,000 years. Far from the cosmopolitan clamor of the Levantine coast, a different, more ancient rhythm governed life in the rugged hills of the Peloponnese, the heartland of the Mycenaean kingdoms. Here, a farmer's world was defined not by the sea, but by the soil and the seasons, his days unfolding beneath the watchful gaze of the monumental citadel perched on a nearby hilltop. His morning would begin before the sun had crested the mountains, the air still cool and damp with dew as he led his goats out to pasture, their bells a gentle, clanking sound in the quiet dawn. His life's work was etched into the landscape itself, in the gnarled and ancient olive trees that clung to the rocky slopes, their silver-green leaves shimmering in the stark Greek light. He would spend long hours tending to these trees, pruning their branches with a small bronze sickle, his hands stained with the dark sap, knowing that the rich, golden oil they produced was the true wealth of his land, demanded as tribute by the palace bureaucracy. On the small, carefully constructed terraces below the olive groves, he would cultivate his meager crops of barley and wheat, his wooden plough, perhaps tipped with a precious bronze share, turning over the thin, reddish soil. He would likely never enter the great fortress of his king, the Wanax, but its presence was a constant, looming reality, a symbol of both protection and obligation. From his fields, he could see the sun glinting off the immense, unmortared stones of its cyclopean walls, a structure so massive it seemed to have been built by giants rather than by men. The palace was a distant world of scribes and soldiers, of storerooms filled with thousands of clay jars of oil and wine, a world that measured his life's output in precise, recorded quantities. His own existence was far simpler, a cycle of planting and harvesting, of mending his tools and repairing the stone walls of his terraces, a life of profound toil lived in the long, formidable shadow of power. The sounds of his world were the chirp of cicadas in the oppressive heat of midday, the bleating of his sheep, and the distant, rhythmic clang of a smith's hammer, forging the bronze that held their society together. If the Mycenaean farmer represented the productive base of this world, then the Hittite scribe, nestled deep within the stone archives of the capital city of Hattusa, represented its administrative mind. In the cool, dry air of the Anatolian plateau, far from the humidity of the coast, the work of empire was carried out not with the sword, but with the stylus. One can picture a scribe's chamber, a quiet room where the only light came from a high, narrow window or the steady, smokeless flame of a sesame oil lamp, casting a gentle glow upon stacks of reddish-brown clay tablets. The air would carry the clean, earthy scent of damp clay and the faint, dusty smell of baked earth from tablets centuries old, a library not of paper, but of stone. The process was one of patient, methodical craft, beginning with a junior apprentice kneading a lump of refined clay until it was free of impurities and air bubbles, before shaping it into a smooth, pillar-like tablet, cool and heavy in the hand. This blank slate would then be passed to a master scribe, who, with a sharpened reed or boned stylus, would begin the painstaking work of impressing wedge-shaped marks into the soft surface. This was cuneiform, a script of immense complexity, and the scribe was a highly trained and respected specialist, his skill the essential technology of imperial control. He was not composing epic poetry or personal letters, his task was the recording of reality as the state perceived it. He might be transcribing a royal decree from the great king, listing the gods as witnesses to a treaty with a lesser vassal state. Or perhaps he was compiling an inventory, his stylus moving methodically across the clay, noting the number of sheep delivered as tribute from a conquered province, or the precise quantity of wine to be allocated to the priests of the storm god for a coming festival. Once completed and checked, the tablet would be dried in the sun or baked in a kiln for permanence, becoming a single, incorruptible data point in the vast, complex machinery of a sprawling and literate empire. The silence of the archive was the sound of power being exercised with bureaucratic precision. Religion, in this era, was not a distinct sphere of life but the very medium in which it was lived, a constant presence that manifested in both grand, theatrical displays of state power and quiet, intimate household rituals. In the great city of Thebes, the religious capital of Egypt's new kingdom, one might witness the spectacular festival of Opet, a public celebration that reaffirmed the divine connection between the pharaoh and the gods. For days, the city would be alive with anticipation, culminating in a magnificent procession where the sacred barks, carrying the hidden cult statues of the gods Amun, Mut, and Khonsu, were carried from the sprawling temple complex of Karnak to the southern sanctuary of Luxor. Thousands of citizens would line the avenue of sphinxes connecting the temples, a human sea of white linen, their faces turned upwards in awe. The air would be thick and heavy, a heady mixture of incense, lotus blossoms offered by the priests, and the scent of roasted meat from the enormous public feast sponsored by the pharaoh. The sounds were a layered symphony of devotion, the deep chanting of the priests, the high, metallic rattle of the sistrums shaken by priestesses, and the low, reverent murmur of the crowd as the golden, jewel-encrusted shrines passed by, a dazzling and overwhelming display of the wealth and piety of the world's most powerful king. Yet for every such monumental display, there were countless smaller, quieter acts of faith that formed the true bedrock of the Bronze Age spiritual world. A traveler wandering the winding lanes of a small Cretan village or a Canaanite town might glimpse, through an open doorway, a family gathered at dusk. In a specially designated corner of their simple home, a small niche in the wall would serve as a household shrine. Here, a small, crudely molded terracotta figurine of a local goddess, her features worn smooth by generations of touch, would receive humble offerings, a single wildflower picked from a nearby field, a small barley cake fresh from the hearth, a splash of wine poured into a simple clay bowl. The prayers offered here were not for the glory of empire or the fate of nations, but for the intimate concerns of daily life, a plea for a safe childbirth, for the recovery of a sick child, for the autumn rains to be plentiful, or for a husband's safe return from a trading voyage. This was a religion of the soil and the soul, a deeply personal conversation with the unseen forces that governed the turning of the seasons and the small triumphs and tragedies of a human life. The very name of the age speaks to its technological foundation, for the alloy of bronze was the revolutionary material that shaped its tools, its art, and its weapons. The creation of bronze was a complex and demanding process that was, in itself, a microcosm of the era's long-distance networks of trade and exchange. The primary ingredient, copper, was relatively plentiful, mined in great quantities on the island of Cyprus, known in diplomatic correspondence as Alatia, its landscape scarred by the slag heaps of ancient smelters. But the second, vital component, tin, was mysteriously scarce, its true origin a closely guarded secret of the merchants who controlled its flow. Historians believe it may have traveled thousands of miles on arduous overland caravan routes from the remote mountains of what is now Afghanistan, a journey of many months that made it more precious, at times, than gold. Without this fragile, globe-spanning supply chain, the Bronze Age itself could not exist. In a workshop near a palace or a major port, the air would be perpetually hazy with smoke and filled with the deafening roar of industry. One would see the master smith, a figure of immense importance and skill, orchestrating the violent transformation of rock into metal. The process began with the bellows, often operated by young apprentices, their rhythmic pumping forcing a steady stream of air into the charcoal-fired forge, raising the temperature to a blistering heat that made the very air shimmer. Copper and tin were carefully weighed and placed in a clay crucible, which was then thrust into the glowing heart of the fire. The smith would watch intently, his eyes shielded from the glare, as the metal slowly slumped, melted, and finally fused into a single, glowing liquid, the surface shimmering like the sun. Then came the most dangerous moment, the pour. With long tongs, the smith and his assistants would lift the white-hot crucible and tip its molten contents into a waiting mold, often made of carved soapstone or packed clay. The liquid bronze would hiss and spit as it filled the form of an axe head, a dagger, or a decorative mirror, a moment of elemental creation that was the very heartbeat of the civilization. The flavors and aromas of this lost world, like its social structure, were deeply stratified, a clear division between the simple, sustaining fare of the common people and the elaborate cuisine of the palace elite. For the Mycenaean farmer or the Canaanite potter, a typical meal was a humble affair, dictated by the rhythms of the harvest and the limits of their own production. The foundation of their diet was bread, but it was not the light, airy loaf of later times. It was a dense, coarse, and often gritty flatbread made from barley or emmer wheat, ground by hand each day on a stone quern. Accompanying this would be a piece of sharp, salty cheese made from goat's or sheep's milk, a handful of sun-dried olives, and perhaps a warming bowl of lentil or chickpea stew, seasoned with wild thyme and oregano gathered from the hillsides. Their drink would be water from the local spring, or a rough, young wine heavily diluted with water, consumed more for its calories and safety than for its flavor. It was a diet born of the earth, simple, repetitive, and providing just enough energy for another day of hard labor. By stark contrast, a banquet in the great hall of an Egyptian noble or Assyrian king was an assault on the senses, a display of wealth and power as potent as any monument. Here, in a long, low-lit room, guests would recline on comfortable cushions, the air fragrant with burning incense and the sound of a lyre or harp being plucked softly in the corner. The low tables would be laden not with coarse barley bread, but with dozens of dishes showcasing the reach of the king's domain and his trade networks. There would be whole roasted ducks glistening with honey, tender legs of lamb seasoned with cumin and coriander, and fresh fish from the sea grilled with herbs. Piles of pomegranates, figs, and dates offered a sweet counterpoint to the savory meats, alongside delicate cakes made from the finest sifted wheat flour, sweetened with date syrup and studded with imported nuts. The wine served was not the local vintage, but prized vintages from the vineyards of the Levant or the Nile Delta, decanted from large, elegant Canaanite jars that were themselves a symbol of sophisticated taste and immense wealth. To be invited to such a feast was to be reminded of one's place in the cosmic order, to taste the sweetness of power and the vast distance that separated the palace from the field. The artistic and architectural achievements of the late Bronze Age stand as the most enduring testament to its values, its fears, and its aspirations, revealing a world of startling contrasts. On the island of Crete, the lingering influence of the earlier Minoan civilization produced an art of astonishing vitality and grace, a celebration of life connected to the sea and the natural world. One might encounter in the ruins of a palace or a wealthy villa the vibrant remnants of a fresco, its colors still brilliant after millennia. Here, on a wall of wet plaster, an artist's hand had captured a pod of dolphins leaping through a turquoise sea, their bodies rendered with a fluid, dynamic energy that seems to defy the stillness of the medium. Elsewhere, one might find the famous bull leaping scene, where young men and women, with impossible elegance, vault over the back of a charging bull, an image of ritual and motion that is both terrifying and beautiful. The lines are flowing, the colors are bright ochres, reds, and blues, and the overall feeling is one of openness and a joyful, if dangerous, engagement with the world. To travel from the open, unfortified palaces of Crete to the Greek mainland was to enter another world, one defined by war, fortification, and a more severe, martial aesthetic. The approach to the citadel of Mycenae was designed not to welcome, but to intimidate. A visitor would follow a steep, winding path up a defensive ramp, feeling small and exposed beneath the towering walls. The entrance itself, the legendary Lion Gate, is a masterpiece of psychological architecture. It is constructed from gargantuan, precisely cut blocks of limestone, so large that later Greeks, forgetting the skills of their ancestors, would attribute their construction to the mythical, one-eyed giants known as the Cyclopes. Above the massive lintel stone, a triangular slab of carved relief depicts two powerful lionesses, their heads, likely of precious metal, now lost, their front paws resting on a central pillar. They are not playful animals, they are guardians, symbols of raw, implacable power, their muscular bodies taut and ready. The feeling here is not of joyful celebration, but of awe mixed with a distinct sense of foreboding. This was the art of a warrior aristocracy, a society that built its grandest monuments to keep the world out, a stark and prophetic contrast to the open spirit of its Aegean neighbors. Rest well. We will meet again at dusk. The Gilded Age of any great civilization can feel, to those living within it, as though it were a permanent state of being, a natural and eternal order. Yet, like a subtle change in the quality of the afternoon light, the first indications of evening are often small and easily dismissed, visible only to those who are watching the horizon with a particular and anxious attention. For the interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age, these first shadows began to fall not in the clash of armies, but in the quiet scratching of a stylus upon a clay tablet, a plea dispatched across the sea from one royal court to another. A letter, believed to be from a Hittite queen to the court of the Egyptian pharaoh, survives in the archaeological record, its message a stark and chilling departure from the usual diplomatic pleasantries of exchanged gifts and dynastic marriages. In the terse, formal language of cuneiform, she makes a simple, desperate request for grain, concluding with the devastatingly plain statement, "I have no grain in my lands." This was not a negotiation for tribute or a boast of conquest, it was the admission of a fundamental failure at the very heart of the empire, a confession of vulnerability from a power that had once seemed immovable. One can almost feel the dry, chalky texture of that clay tablet, a small rectangle of baked mud carrying a message of impending doom, passed from the hand of a desperate queen to a royal messenger who would begin a long and uncertain journey south. Such a plea would have been a profound shock to the system, a crack in the carefully constructed facade of divine kingship and endless plenty that all great powers sought to project. The correspondence of this period, unearthed from the ruins of cities like Ugarit on the Syrian coast, tells a similar story of growing anxiety. Reports from merchants speak of unknown ships sighted off the coast, their intentions unclear but assumed to be hostile, while governors of coastal towns write to their overlords begging for reinforcements that will never arrive. The great conversation between kings, once a confident dialogue of equals, begins to fray, the tone shifting from assured strength to a thinly veiled panic as the fundamental assurances of the old world began, one by one, to dissolve. The intricate network of messengers and diplomats, which had for centuries stitched the Eastern Mediterranean into a single political and economic fabric, now carried whispers of famine and piracy, the first tremors of a systemic earthquake that was gathering force just beneath the surface of their glittering world. These desperate missives were not isolated incidents of mismanagement, but rather the human consequence of a much deeper and more silent crisis unfolding across the land itself, a crisis written not in ink or clay, but in the very soil and air. Modern scientific analysis, studying ancient pollen trapped in the deep mud of lake beds and the subtle variations in the growth rings of long-dead trees, points towards a prolonged and severe climatic shift that began in the decades around 1200 BCE. This was not a simple drought lasting a season or two, but a profound and persistent change in weather patterns, a megadrought that settled over the eastern Mediterranean for generations, withering the agricultural base upon which these great empires were built. The once reliable winter rains failed to arrive year after year, leaving the fertile plains of Anatolia and the Levant gasping for moisture, the earth cracking into a fine, pale dust under a relentless sun. The great rivers, the lifeblood of the region, would have dwindled in their beds, becoming sluggish, shallow streams where powerful currents once flowed, making irrigation a desperate and ultimately futile exercise for millions. A traveler journeying through the Hittite heartland or the Greek mainland during these years would have witnessed a landscape slowly dying, the terraced hillsides of olive groves producing only shriveled, bitter fruit, and the vast fields of wheat and barley yielding little more than stunted, scorched stalks. The air itself would have felt different, thick with the constant presence of dust rather than the scent of damp earth or blossoming grain, and the silence of the fields would have been heavy, unbroken by the usual sounds of harvesting and labor. This environmental catastrophe struck at the very foundation of the palace economy, a highly centralized system designed to function on the assumption of agricultural surplus, where the king's storehouses were the heart of the entire state. These immense granaries, once overflowing symbols of the ruler's power and his ability to provide for his people, would have slowly emptied, their cavernous interiors echoing with the footsteps of scribes whose tallies now recorded only deficits and failures. The entire edifice of Bronze Age power, built on the predictable cycle of seasons and the promise of a full harvest, was being steadily and inexorably starved into submission by a force no army could fight and no king could command. A kingdom can withstand a poor harvest for a single season, perhaps even two, but the palace-centered world of the late Bronze Age possessed a particular and dangerous fragility that made it uniquely vulnerable to this kind of prolonged crisis. These were not societies of independent farmers and merchants, but profoundly top-heavy structures, where a tiny, literate elite, numbering perhaps less than 1% of the population, controlled nearly all of the wealth and power. This ruling class, the king, his family, his priests, his military commanders, and his scribes, lived in opulent palaces adorned with vibrant frescoes and furnished with goods from across the known world, their lives a world away from the vast majority of the populace. For the common farmer, weaver, or potter, life was one of service to the palace, their labor and its products funneled upwards into the central administration in exchange for rations of grain, oil, and wool. This system, for all its intricate bureaucracy and impressive scale, functioned on a brittle social contract, loyalty and labor in exchange for security and sustenance. When the state granaries began to empty and the ration distributions faltered and then failed, that contract was irrevocably broken. The abstract loyalty to a distant king, a Wanax or a great sun god on earth, means very little to a parent whose children are crying from hunger. As the drought wore on, the immense social pyramid began to fracture from its base. We can only speculate on the precise sequence of events, as the voices of the common people are silent in the official records, but the archaeological evidence of burned palaces and abandoned settlements tells a story of social disintegration. One can imagine the slow descent into chaos, first, sullen refusals to hand over what little grain was harvested, then, communities simply abandoning their fields and villages to seek survival elsewhere, and finally, perhaps, desperate and violent uprisings, with hungry mobs storming the very palaces and storehouses that had failed them. The immense gulf between the perfumed luxury of the ruling class and the precarious existence of the peasantry became an unbridgeable chasm, and when the rains failed, the bonds of deference and obligation that held the system together simply evaporated under the heat of starvation and despair. Into this deeply unstable landscape of failing states, parched fields, and hungry populations, a new and unsettling element appears in the historical and archaeological record, a phenomenon known to us primarily through the panicked inscriptions of their last great victim, the Egyptian New Kingdom. They are called, in these accounts, the Sea Peoples, a name that conjures images of a unified, invading armada, but the reality was likely something far more chaotic and complex. These were not a single nation or a coherent empire. They were a symptom of the collapse, not its primary cause. The Sea Peoples were the cascading, human fallout of the crisis, a motley and desperate coalition of the displaced, set in motion by the famines and social breakdowns occurring all across the eastern Mediterranean. They were the inhabitants of the collapsing Mycenaean citadels, the farmers from the drought-stricken Anatolian plateau, the desperate citizens of failed city-states in Cyprus and the Levant, all taking to the sea in a desperate search for a new home, for plunder, or for mere survival. The famous reliefs at Medinet Habu, carved by order of Pharaoh Rameses III, provide a haunting snapshot of this strange and varied coalition. The images show tall warriors wearing distinctive feathered headdresses, identified as the Pele set, who are thought to be the ancestors of the Philistines. Alongside them are the Sheaden, mercenaries known for their horned helmets and round shields, who had at times fought both for and against the Egyptians. But mixed in with these warriors are depictions of families, of women and children riding in heavy, solid-wheeled ox carts, their meager worldly possessions piled high around them. This was not simply an army on the march, it was an entire society in motion, a folk wandering on water, a flotilla of refugees whose desperation had turned them into raiders. They moved along the coastlines of Anatolia and the Levant like a slow-moving storm, their arrival marked by the scent of wood smoke from burning port cities like Ugarit, and the chaotic sound of myriad languages and dialects mingling on crowded beachheads as they landed, fought, and moved on, absorbing more displaced people into their ranks as they went. They were the end point of the logic of collapse, a human tide of chaos washing over the last remnants of the old world. The intricate web of trade that had bound these empires together for centuries was not merely a matter of exchanging luxury goods, it was the very skeleton upon which their economic and military power was constructed, a system whose complexity was also its greatest weakness. The chaos unleashed by the migrating sea peoples and the general breakdown of state authority had a devastating effect on these vital supply chains, severing the arteries that had nourished the Bronze Age world. Of all the commodities that moved along these routes, none was more critical than tin, the rare and essential ingredient that, when alloyed with common copper, created the eponymous metal of the age, bronze. Without a steady supply of tin, the entire technological basis of these civilizations was rendered useless. Bronze was the substance of power, the material used for the swords and spearheads of the royal armies, the intricate helmets and cuirasses of the elite chariot corps, and the durable tools required for monumental construction and agricultural work. The sources of tin were few and located far from the centers of power, with the most likely mines situated in the distant mountains of what is now Afghanistan or perhaps even further west in Europe. The metal began a long and perilous journey, passed from the hand of one merchant to another, traveling overland by donkey caravan for thousands of miles before being loaded onto the sturdy, single-masted ships that plied the Mediterranean. As the roads became infested with bandits and the sea swarmed with pirates, many of them former merchants themselves, this delicate chain of supply broke down. A palace scribe in Pylos or Mycenae would have simply noted that the ships from the east had stopped arriving, and the royal quartermaster would report that the strategic reserve of tin was dwindling. One can picture the scene in a royal armory, the forges growing cold, the master smiths anxiously measuring out the last few ingots, recasting broken swords rather than forging new ones. This was not a sudden, dramatic event, but a slow, creeping paralysis, a technological regression forced not by a new invention, but by the loss of an old connection. The Age of Bronze did not end because a better material was discovered, but because the great kings, for all their power, could no longer acquire the simple, silvery metal that had made their world possible. The final chapter of any great civilization is rarely written by its own scribes, for their world often ends before their ink has a chance to dry. Instead, the story is told much later, by the patient trowel of the archaeologist, and it is a tale read not in flowing prose but in layers of dust and ash. Across the eastern Mediterranean, from the citadel of Mycenae to the shores of Syria, the beginning of the 12th century before the Common Era is marked by a uniform and grim signature, a thick, black stratum of violent destruction. In the excavated ruins of once mighty cities, this burn layer can be as thick as a man's arm, a stark, carbonized line separating the age of palaces and empires from the long silence that followed, a textural memory of a world consumed by fire. a visitor to the archaeological site of the great port of Ugarit might feel the fine, pale dust of the Levant on their skin as they walk through the stone foundations of what was once a bustling cosmopolitan center. It is here that the evidence is particularly poignant, where the city's final moments were captured with a startling immediacy. The Grand Palace, with its dozens of rooms and courtyards, was put to the torch, its great timber beams crashing down and baking the clay architecture into a brittle, reddish ceramic. At Pylos, in southwestern Greece, the palace of the legendary King Nestor met an identical fate, the inferno so intense that it vitrified storeroom jars, their contents of oil and wine feeding the flames that would inadvertently preserve the kingdom's final records, baking its clay tablets for future scholars to decipher. And far to the east, in the heart of Anatolia, the sprawling Hittite capital of Hattusa, a city of granite and temples built to last for eternity, was not merely sacked but systematically abandoned, its gates left open to the wind and its great gods left to stare out from their reliefs into an empty, silent landscape. The violence appears to have been almost synchronous, a wave of catastrophe that washed over a whole generation of cities within the space of perhaps 40 or 50 years. This was not the slow, dignified decline of an aging power, but a sudden and brutal amputation. Archaeologists sifting through the debris find the mundane objects of daily life left exactly where they fell, cooking pots still on the hearth, precious imported pottery from Cyprus and the Aegean scattered on the floor, and, most chillingly, the unburied skeletons of the last inhabitants, caught in the final, desperate moments of their city's life. The evidence points not to a single cause, but to a confluence of pressures, a perfect storm where the complex, interconnected systems of trade, diplomacy, and agriculture failed all at once, leaving each glittering capital to face its doom alone. The great web of the Bronze Age world, so carefully woven over centuries, had become a trap, transmitting shockwaves of collapse from one kingdom to the next with terrifying speed. In a ruined house near the western gate of Ugarit, a small, beehive-shaped oven was unearthed, and within it, a collection of clay tablets was found, placed there to be fired into permanence. These were not administrative records or epic poems, but the last, desperate diplomatic correspondence of a kingdom on the brink of oblivion. One tablet, a letter from the king of Ugarit, Amurapi, to the king of Alasia in Cyprus, is a plea for aid that conveys a heart-stopping sense of panic. The king explains that his own army is far away in Hittite lands and his navy is patrolling the coast of Lycia, leaving his own country undefended. He writes of an unnamed enemy, whose ships have appeared on the horizon, and who are even now setting fire to the countryside and sacking the villages. One can almost feel the scribe's hand trembling as he impressed the cuneiform script into the soft clay, the scent of smoke perhaps already drifting through the palace windows. Another tablet from the same kill contains an even more chilling message, a short, frantic report apparently from a coastal observer to his superior in the capital. It speaks of the enemy's ships, sighted at sea, and conveys a terrifying sense of helplessness in the face of an unknown and overwhelming force. This final dispatch, this last warning from the coast, was never sent. The oven in which it was placed was intended to make it a permanent record, but the city fell before the firing was complete, and the tablet was instead buried by the very destruction it was meant to report. For over 3,000 years, this final, silent message lay waiting in the darkness, a testament to a world where the news of its own annihilation arrived too late to be delivered, a quiet emblem of the collapse itself. These last letters from Ugarit are the authentic voice of the end, a record of the precise moment when the complex palace bureaucracy, with all its scribes and messengers, finally broke down, its last desperate plea for help left unheard. While the cities of Greece, Anatolia, and the Levant were consumed by this tide of destruction, the oldest and grandest kingdom of them all, Egypt, managed to hold on. The temple walls at Medinet Habu, near the ancient capital of Thebes, stand today as a monumental record of this struggle for survival. Here, the pharaoh Ramesses III carved vast, intricate reliefs depicting his campaigns against a mysterious coalition of invaders, whom his scribes simply called the peoples of the sea. The carvings show a chaotic melee of land and sea battles, with Egyptian soldiers clashing against a confederation of unfamiliar foes, their families traveling with them in heavy, ox-drawn carts. The inscriptions list the names of these peoples: the Peleset, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, and the Weshesh, tribes whose exact origins remain a subject of intense scholarly debate. Ramesses III boasts in his inscriptions that he repelled these invaders, defeating them in a great naval battle in the Nile Delta and slaughtering them on the shores of his kingdom, preserving the divine order of Egypt. And in a narrow sense, he was successful. The reliefs show Egyptian ships overwhelming the invaders' boats, and archers raining down arrows from the riverbanks. Yet the victory was a Pyrrhic one, a costly and brutal triumph that marked not a resurgence of Egyptian power, but the beginning of its long, slow twilight. The effort of repelling the Sea Peoples, combined with the loss of its imperial territories and trade routes in the Levant, fatally weakened the new kingdom. The treasury was exhausted, the army was stretched to its limit, and the immense cost of these campaigns led to internal strife, including the first recorded labor strike in history, when the tomb workers at Deir el-Medina did not receive their customary grain rations. Egypt survived the Bronze Age collapse, but it emerged a shadow of its former self, a diminished power gazing back at its own glorious past, forever haunted by the great effort of its own survival. In the century that followed the fires and the battles, a profound and eerie silence descended upon the eastern Mediterranean. The great palaces were now silent ruins, their painted frescoes flaking in the sun, their throne rooms filled with rubble and wind-blown sand. Hattusa, the city of 1,000 gods, was left to the wolves and the weeds, its grand avenues and temples slowly surrendering to the Anatolian highlands. In Greece, the mighty citadels of Mycenae and Tiryns, once the hubs of a sophisticated and wealthy civilization, were reduced to sparsely populated villages huddled within the cyclopean walls of their ancestors, the art of their construction now a forgotten mystery. The complex, centralized palace economies that had managed the production and distribution of everything from grain to perfume simply ceased to exist, and with them, the elite class of scribes and administrators who had run them. Perhaps the most devastating loss was not of stone or gold, but of knowledge itself. The intricate writing systems that had been the hallmark of these civilizations vanished almost overnight. In Greece, the Linear B script, used for centuries by Mycenaean scribes to keep meticulous palace records, disappeared completely. With its disappearance, the people of the Aegean world were plunged into a period of illiteracy that would last for over 400 years, a long, dark age from which no written records survive. An entire culture effectively lost its memory, forgetting the names of its old kings and the maps of its old trade routes. Similarly, the complex cuneiform script of the Hittites fell into disuse, surviving only in isolated pockets. It is a sobering thought that for many generations, the descendants of those who had lived in these glittering empires could walk through the ruins of their ancestors' cities without any understanding of who had built them, or what the strange markings on the fallen stones might have once meant. Out of the ashes of this collapsed world, a new one began to slowly and haltingly take shape, a world that was poorer, more fragmented, and far more insular than the one it had replaced. The grand internationalism of the late Bronze Age, with its great kings calling each other brother in their diplomatic letters, was gone forever. In its place rose a patchwork of smaller, more localized powers, petty kingdoms, tribal chiefdoms, and nascent city-states, each struggling to survive in a landscape of ruins. The intricate trade networks that had once moved tin from the far west and lapis lazuli from the east had been shattered, and with them, the supply of copper and tin needed to make bronze, the very metal that gave the age its name. It was in this environment of scarcity and disruption that a new metal, once considered rare and of little practical use, began to gain prominence. Iron, whose ores were far more widespread than those of copper or tin, became the material of necessity. The transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age was not a technological leap forward born of innovation, but rather a step sideways, born of desperation. The first iron tools and weapons were often inferior to their bronze counterparts, but they could be made locally, without reliance on a now non-existent international supply chain. In Greece, the scattered communities of the Dark Age turned inward, developing their own distinct dialects and customs. In the Levant, new peoples like the Phoenicians and the Israelites emerged, building their societies on the ruins of the old Canaanite city-states. This new world was one of survivors, of small-scale farmers and local strongmen, a world where the memory of the great empires was becoming little more than a myth, a tale told around a flickering fire of a lost golden age when gods and heroes walked the earth. And so the voices of the great kings fall silent, their correspondence of baked clay left unanswered in the archives of cities that no longer have names, their grand titles fading into the dust of a world undone. The wind now whispers through the shattered lion gate at Mycenae, and it carries not the scent of olive oil and royal feasts, but only the fine, dry powder of abandonment. What was once a vibrant tapestry of interconnected empires, from the Anatolian plateau of the Hittites to the sun-drenched shores of the Aegean, has become a collection of silent ruins, a testament to a sudden and profound emptiness. The last king of the Hittites, Suppiluliuma II, vanishes from the record, his final plea for aid seemingly lost to the indifferent sea, a final, fading signal from a civilization on the brink of dissolution. It is difficult for us now to fully grasp the sheer completeness of this prior world, a world where a king in Egypt could write to his brother in Babylon as if he were a near neighbor, discussing the exchange of royal daughters and the market price of gold. This was the age revealed in the Amarna letters, a complex ballet of diplomacy, trade, and shared culture that bound the Eastern Mediterranean together in a web of mutual dependence, a system so intricate and seemingly robust that its architects must have believed it would last for eternity. Tin from the distant mountains of the east flowed west, and copper from Cyprus flowed east, meeting in the bustling workshops of Ugarit to be forged into the bronze that gave the age its very name, the metal of its swords, its plowshares, and its gods. The reasons for this great unraveling are written not in a single book, but in the parched earth of a multi-decade drought and in the ash of burned palaces, a cascade of calamities that overwhelmed the most powerful states of the known world. The desperate inscriptions of Rameses III at Medinet Habu speak of a tide of displaced humanity, the so-called sea peoples who came not just to conquer but to find a new home in a world where their own had failed them. These migrations were likely not the cause of the collapse, but a desperate symptom of it, as the intricate palace economies, once the very engines of prosperity, proved to be exquisitely fragile, shattering like fine pottery when the steady flow of grain and metal was finally interrupted. What followed was not merely a period of rebuilding, but a long and profound twilight, a forgetting. In Greece, the memory of writing itself was lost for centuries, the complex syllabaries of the palace scribes vanishing along with the palaces themselves, replaced by a simpler, harsher existence defined by the cold utility of iron. The stories of Troy and Mycenae lingered, but they became the stuff of myth, their protagonists transformed into demigods and monsters, the true memory of a connected, literate, Bronze Age world almost entirely erased. The collapse was a quiet reminder that the most glittering international systems are themselves living organisms, susceptible to fevers and famines that can bring about a swift and unforgiving end, leaving behind a silence that might last for generations. Rest well. We will meet again at dusk.